We would like to move on to Calvin to also help us answer the question. Can you tell us about systemic racism? Thank you, Calvin.
Yes, and I was thinking before we started this, I said, okay, I'm gonna talk about systemic racism. I hope everybody's comfortable because I can talk tomorrow just to talk about the things that I'm seeing in this country. And I said, you know what? I'm gonna focus on one part of it that has been a real part of the discussion and the protests that we're seeing in this country today. The Attorney General of the United States and several other high-ranking government officials, including President Trump and other people in the White House, have recently been asked, what do you want to do to solve systemic racism, which was a question that everybody's been asking for decades. And, there were people who genuinely didn't want to solve it, but they would do things knowing it wouldn't work. They weren't really supportive. They were supportive words, but that was all. This administration says, wait, we don't even think it's a thing. Systemic racism doesn't even exist. And it baffles me because the one thing in this country, a lot of times money will help mitigate a lot. Racism is so deep in this country. I always tell myself, if Barack Obama was on the street and somebody didn't recognize him, he is in the same position as somebody who has no money and has no power. Our racism here doesn't care where you come from, how much money you have, if you're Oprah or if you're homeless. So I began to think, why is it that we have gone backwards and that we have a lot of people who don't even believe that systemic racism exists? And I'll tell you why. And this comes from my perspective as a communicator of helping our clients deal with complex messages. I said, how can you ask a white person in power if systemic racism exists? And here's why. A lot of times when people hear the term systemic racism, they think about the people who are in charge of that system now and those leaders, that if that system is racist, then they are racist. And nobody wants to admit they are racist. And so you have a lot of people, some who aren't genuinely concerned, but some who genuinely are, who'll tell you it can't be systemic racism because I'm the mayor of my town. If that's systemic, I'm ahead of the system. So you're telling me I'm a racist. That's not what systemic racism is. We have to make sure they know it's not just the leaders who might happen to be racist, but it's that our system was founded on racist principles. And that when we see what's happening, with whether it be police brutality or anything else, redlining, economic issues, it's systemic because the system is working the way it was designed to work. We need to reform the system. And once people realize that that's what we're talking about and not just talking about a particular person being racist, we'll understand it. And the one example that I want to give about that, because when I mentioned that to white colleagues and friends of mine, they would say, well, how is the system racist in itself? Well, I'll tell you, when we talk about George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others, one of the reasons why it's hard to get justice for them is what happened to them was completely legal. And that's why we need to reform our system. Now, obviously, sometimes people go beyond the line, but we have a system set up that that we give policemen the benefit of the doubt against victims. And in some cases, you can't even charge them with something. So I think that is a perfect example of systemic racism, that we not only have to deal with the people that are racist, but we have a system that is set up to make racism flourish. And until we recognize that, we're not going to change anything.
Thank you very much, Calvin, for the very insightful discussion about what systemic racism really is.
We all know the death of Breonna Taylor and also that of George Floyd has indeed sparked a lot of mixed feelings around. We had people who were protesting. I mean, it was not just in America, other countries, even in Africa, countries like Nigeria and Ghana even joined with the protest. I mean, we even had where they had to take down monuments and do a lot of stuff just to make sure that people understand that Black lives indeed matter. But I just want to ask this question. I mean, this is not the first time we're protesting. This is not the first time people are protesting in America. So I would like to start with Calvin, please. What do you think about all this? I mean, how far can we go with this? Because recently, till now, they've not arrested the main killers of Brian Taylor. I mean, the issues is still, it's going, it keeps continuing. So what do you think? What do you think about all this? How far can we really go?
Well, the simple answer to that is I think we have the potential to go really far. And, let me just tell you why I think these two horrific yet two common situations moved us further for more in the future. I think two factors. One is the global pandemic, because let's be honest, people have been sitting in their houses upset, and the other factor is I don't like to give the President of the United States much airspace and much credit, but he in his positions, I'll put it like this. He has not shied away from saying things that other people in power have felt they were just too ashamed to say. He's not ashamed to criticize modern day civil rights leaders who just passed, like John Lewis. He's not afraid to say things like, I'm going to protect your suburban dream lifestyle from low income housing. He's saying those things. So with that together, that's why I think we've seen a lot of folks who maybe were lulled into thinking that we were getting there, but that old way of thinking, they're saying it's not so old, okay? And when it comes to those two cases in particular, once again, this is for me, about messaging. And that's why I want you to watch really close when you see US leaders and some world leaders and some people in the media. We have to be careful that we always tell the story of Breonna and George Floyd within the context of the problems that we have had and are having. We must make sure that people realize that the horrific things that happened to them are connected to what's happened to so many other victims and what everybody, African Americans in this country, myself included, are facing. Let me tell you why you've got to do that. One of the things that I think a lot of people in this country and outside were surprised at is people like Donald Trump, people like our Attorney General. They have spoken out forcefully about these cases. President Trump even said, this was a murder. It was horrific. Pence, Vice President Pence said these things. But let me tell you what's wrong with that. They want to individualize it so much that it's a horrific one-off incident. It's not racism. This was a horrible, horrific mistake. And the reason they want to do that and not put it in the context of greater systemic racism is that forces them to realize what the real problem is. So I think that one of the ways that we can make the most out of these horrific situations is never let their names come out of our mouth without honoring them and the sacrifices that they unfortunately made as part of our own struggle. And this isn't just a random thing that happened to a random person at a random time.
Hashtag Black Lives Matter. Firstly, we want to look at what is the history behind it. Secondly, what will it take for those three words to become a movement and not just a hype? That would be Calvin. Calvin will take us through that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Calvin.
Okay. So just for everybody's benefit, like the technical beginning of Black Lives Matter, where, a group of activists after Trayvon Martin was killed in Florida by George Zimmerman, that's when the movement started. It was not only a continuation of the civil rights struggle that we've always had in this country. A lot of people think of it as an updated, sit-in movement, what was going on in the 50s and 60s. And in some ways it is. But what it was also intended to do was to make sure that within that movement for increased civil rights, that we don't leave people out that have been left out before, like African-American women, the LGBT community, all of these voices within Black and Brown communities that have their larger struggle and then the struggle for their smaller group. sometimes their messages were not included. So that's a short version of how Black Lives Matter started, and it also coincided with unfortunately, if you ask some people in this country that aren't Black and brown about police brutality and Trayvon Martin and George Floyd and the dozens of others, they would say, oh yes, this is horrible. You know, this started a few years ago. And Black people in this country know that it didn't start a few years ago. What did start is that we now have the technology to let everybody know what's going on, that you didn't believe us when we told you. But now you get to see it with your own eyes. And I mean, that's incredibly positive, because there are a lot of people that didn't believe that police brutality, for example, was a real thing. And the technology has allowed everybody to see with their own eyes. So what do we do with Black Lives Matter now, here in 2020? I actually do think that it is a movement, and it's not just hype. I think that people have realized that it best expresses what we don't have in this country, and that is a value of Black lives on several levels. Now, here's where we get into the challenge, is as with any movement, especially movements in their beginning, a lot of times people that don't agree with the goals of the movement attack the people who personify in their mind the movement. One of the things I'm very quick to point out here in this country is, you know, you have people like Martin Luther King and John Lewis, and you would hear some people today talk about how they just loved Martin Luther King and how he was our, you know, this great leader for us, and he was. But I want to say, you're part of the same group of people in the way that you act that didn't like Martin Luther King then. Don't forget, he was assassinated. He was ruffling feathers. He was agitating. And so that's why, you know, when you have leaders at all levels in this country are saying that the protesters of Black Lives Matter, that they're anarchists, that they're agitators, that they're not peaceful, some of that is true. There are people that are trying to infiltrate the protest to introduce violence in it. I mean, that's happening for sure. But we also have to remember that in the moment, no real effective movement is viewed positively by the people that need to change their actions for it to be successful. We can now look back at Martin Luther King after all of these decades, because that seems easy to say. But we have those same people who said they love Martin Luther King on TV and in the news criticizing Black Lives Matter. And so one of the things we have to make sure of is that the messaging that we use in our own lives and our efforts in our organizations, that we clearly articulate what Black Lives Matter is, that we recognize that not everybody who supports it supports the same things. And what we have to make sure is that somebody who does something that, if you're an African American, you don't agree with, and they put a hashtag Black Lives Matter on it, nobody can hijack the movement to make it mean one specific thing. Because if we do, then that allows people who have no interest in improving situations to say, well, no, you can't be a Black Lives Matter. There was a violent Black Lives Matter protest there. So if you're for that, you're for terrorism. And if you don't think that's happening, our president already said it here. So I do think that it is a movement. I do think it's more than hype. And I do think that we're going to have to be more careful and pay attention going forward as to what it means and how it reflects the ways that we protest, that we ask for change, that we demand reforms legally, from the police, economically, in all those fields.
So Calvin, please, in 1 minute, can you just tell us, where do we go from here, please?
Yes, really quickly, I think that the best thing that we can do is tell our stories as part of this discussion on race and systemic racism. You know, that means when we talk about it in the media or with our friends or with our colleagues, share experiences. I've had experiences with the police. Share those so that people begin to see that it is prevalent in our lives in ways that we may not have thought about. And the second part is, I think we need to do a better job at encouraging younger people to have that balance, that they've got to try hard, that they've got to be their best, that there are cards stacked against them, but they can make it. And not leaving out this point, that there are systems in place that no matter how hard you work will try to knock you down. We have to tell them that. And the reason why is not to make them victims, but sometimes we are not honest with young people to let them know that there are challenges that exist that will stop you no matter how rich you are or how much, what kind of family you came from. So if we let people know this and we teach them the ways that those of us who have had success in overcoming obstacles, then we'll be equipping people to deal with systemic racism, not piece by piece, but actually changing the system.
Thank you so much for that amazing reply.